Oprah's death row prisoner, appeal denied. The architecture of waiting. In the oldest continuously operating prison in the state of California, the architecture of death row is designed around waiting. At San Quentin State Prison, men sentenced to death live inside a section of the facility known as East Block. The structure dates back to the 19th century. Over time it has been modified repeatedly, but its basic form remains unchanged. 5 tiers of narrow cells stack vertically behind thick steel railings. Each cell measures only a few feet across. Concrete walls. Steel doors. A small window cut into the back wall that allows a limited amount of natural light. For most of the day, movement is restricted to the boundaries of that cell. California's death row population has historically been the largest in the United States. For decades, the system held hundreds of men in a legal status defined by uncertainty. Executions were authorized by sentence, but carried out only after years, often decades, of appeals. The result is a form of incarceration where time stretches in unusual ways. Days are structured by institutional routine. Meals are delivered through a metal slot in the door. Correctional officers conduct regular security counts. Limited yard access is scheduled under supervision. Conversations with other prisoners travel through steel bars and concrete corridors. Everything happens within strict control. Researchers studying long-term confinement have documented the psychological strain created by extended isolation. Federal courts have reviewed these conditions repeatedly over the years, noting that death row housing often restricts social contact, environmental stimulation, and independent movement. At San Quentin, most death row prisoners spend more than 20 hours a day inside their cells. For some, the waiting period extends across decades of legal review. This environment formed the backdrop for the case of Jarvis Masters. Masters arrived at San Quentin in the mid-1980s after being convicted in connection with the murder of a correctional officer during a prison disturbance. The case centered on the 1985 killing of Officer Hal Birchfield inside the prison. According to court records, prosecutors argued that Masters played a role in organizing the attack during a volatile period of tension within the facility. Masters has consistently maintained his innocence. His conviction was based in part on testimony from other incarcerated witnesses and circumstantial evidence presented during the trial. Over the years, the case became one of the most widely discussed death penalty cases in California. Not only because of the legal arguments surrounding the conviction, but because of the unusual public attention it later received. While incarcerated, Masters began writing about his life and experiences in prison. Those writings eventually formed the basis of a memoir. The book, titled That Bird Has My Wings, describes his childhood, his path into incarceration, and his attempts to develop a disciplined spiritual life while living on death row. The memoir later drew the attention of television host and media figure Oprah Winfrey. Winfrey publicly praised the book and helped bring wider attention to Masters' story. Her endorsement introduced the case to a national audience that might otherwise never have encountered it. For supporters of Masters, the memoir became evidence of transformation and personal reflection. For critics, the focus remained on the underlying conviction and the death of a correctional officer. In the legal system, however, public attention does not alter the standard of review. After conviction and sentencing, capital cases move through a long series of appellate procedures. State courts review the trial record. Federal courts may examine constitutional claims raised in habeas corpus petitions. Each stage requires detailed legal arguments supported by documented evidence. In 2013, the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit rejected one of Masters' major federal appeals. The ruling addressed claims that included arguments about legal representation and evidentiary issues raised during earlier proceedings. The appellate panel concluded that the lower court's decisions should stand. The denial did not end all legal avenues, but it marked another point in a process that had already lasted more than 25 years. Inside the prison, the decision changed little about the immediate physical reality. The same narrow cell, the same routines, the same architecture of waiting. Death row incarceration creates a form of suspended time. Sentences are final in theory, but in practice the legal process moves slowly through layers of review. In California, executions have been halted multiple times by court rulings, regulatory disputes, and changes in policy. As a result, many prisoners remain on death row for decades without an execution date. For those living inside East Block, the outside legal battles occur at a distance. Appeals are prepared by attorneys working in offices far beyond the prison walls. Court hearings take place in buildings hundreds of miles away. Written rulings arrive later in envelopes delivered through institutional mail systems. Sometimes the news is brief: a denial, a postponement, a procedural ruling, then the routine resumes. Correctional officers walk the tier. Metal doors open and close for scheduled movement. The fluorescent lights remain on long after night falls outside the prison walls. In this environment, years accumulate slowly. When Jarvis Masters wrote about life inside death row, he described long hours spent reading, meditating, and writing letters. Those activities became part of a daily structure he said helped him maintain focus while confined. Such routines are common coping strategies among long-term prisoners. Researchers studying incarceration have noted that individuals in extended confinement often create strict personal schedules, reading, exercise, writing, or spiritual practice, to impose a sense of order on an otherwise static environment. But none of those routines change the central fact of the sentence. The state of California condemned Masters to death in 1990. And for more than 3 decades, his life has unfolded inside a space measured in feet rather than miles. A single room, a steel door, a narrow view of the outside sky. Beyond those walls, lawyers continue to argue over the details of the case. Evidence, testimony, procedure. Inside the cell, time continues to pass in near silence. The case inside the walls. On the morning of June 20, 1985, violence broke out inside the walls of San Quentin State Prison. Correctional officer Hal Birchfield was escorting an inmate through the prison when he was attacked with a homemade weapon. The weapon, commonly described in court documents as a prison-made knife, was used in a sudden assault that resulted in fatal injuries. Birchfield died shortly afterward. The killing of a correctional officer inside a secure institution immediately triggered a full-scale investigation by prison authorities and state law enforcement. San Quentin at the time housed a volatile population of long-term prisoners. Tensions inside the facility were often high, particularly during the 1980s when overcrowding and gang rivalries were common features of the California prison system. Following the attack, investigators focused on several incarcerated individuals believed to have participated in planning or carrying out the assault. Among them was Jarvis Masters. Masters had already been serving a lengthy sentence at San Quentin for armed robbery. At the time of the incident, he was a young prisoner who had entered the state correctional system years earlier. Prosecutors argued that the killing of Officer Birchfield was not a spontaneous act but a coordinated attack involving multiple prisoners. According to the prosecution's case, Masters had helped supply the weapon used in the assault. The physical evidence in the case was limited. Investigators relied heavily on statements from other incarcerated witnesses who claimed to have knowledge of the planning behind the attack. These witnesses testified that Masters had constructed or passed along the weapon used in the killing. Such testimony became a central component of the trial. In prison-related criminal cases, witness statements from other incarcerated individuals are not unusual. However, legal experts have long debated the reliability of such testimony. Witnesses may receive incentives for cooperating with prosecutors, including reduced sentences or other benefits within the prison system. Defense attorneys representing Masters argued that the case depended heavily on testimony that was inconsistent and unreliable. They also argued that there was no physical evidence directly linking Masters to the weapon used in the attack. Despite those arguments, the jury ultimately convicted him. In 1990, Jarvis Masters was sentenced to death. Capital sentencing in California involves a separate phase following a murder conviction. During that phase, jurors consider aggravating and mitigating circumstances before determining whether the death penalty should be imposed. Once a death sentence is delivered, the case enters an extended appellate process that can last decades. For Masters, that process would become a defining feature of his life. He was transferred to death row housing within the same prison where the original crime had taken place. Inside the East Block at San Quentin State Prison, the environment is tightly structured. Cells are arranged along narrow tiers, with steel bars separating the prisoners from the central corridor. Movement outside the cell occurs only under direct supervision. Legal preparation for appeals often takes place in these confined spaces. Death row prisoners spend years working with attorneys to examine trial records, transcripts, and evidence in search of legal errors that might justify overturning a conviction or sentence. These reviews can involve thousands of pages of documentation, witness statements, forensic reports, procedural decisions made during the original trial. Masters' legal team raised multiple arguments during the appeals process. Among them were claims that key witness testimony may have been unreliable and that certain evidentiary issues had not been adequately addressed during the original proceedings. Supporters of Masters later pointed to declarations from individuals who recanted earlier testimony. Recantations, however, are often viewed cautiously by courts. Judges must evaluate whether such statements are credible and whether they would likely have changed the outcome of the trial. In many cases, courts determine that new statements do not meet the legal threshold required to overturn a conviction. Over the years, several of Masters' appeals were denied. The rulings did not necessarily resolve every disputed detail of the case. Instead, they reflected the strict legal standards governing post-conviction review. Federal courts reviewing death penalty cases do not retry the original case. Their role is to determine whether constitutional violations occurred during the earlier proceedings. If those violations cannot be clearly demonstrated, the conviction is typically upheld. By the early 2000s, the case had begun attracting attention outside the legal system. One reason was the emergence of Masters' personal writing. While confined to his cell, he began composing reflections about his childhood and experiences growing up in poverty before entering the criminal justice system. Those writings eventually developed into a full-length memoir. The book, That Bird Has My Wings, describes a childhood marked by instability, abuse, and early exposure to violence. It also details his years living inside death row at San Quentin State Prison. The memoir received national attention after it was publicly praised by media figure Oprah Winfrey. Winfrey selected the book for recognition and encouraged readers to engage with its account of incarceration and personal reflection. Her endorsement significantly expanded public awareness of the case. For many readers, the memoir introduced them to the complex realities of life inside death row housing. But outside attention does not alter the procedural path of a capital case. Legal appeals proceed according to constitutional standards, independent of public opinion. Years after the book's release, Masters' attorneys continued to challenge aspects of the conviction in federal court. One of the most significant efforts involved a habeas corpus petition filed within the federal appellate system. The petition raised claims regarding witness testimony and legal representation during earlier stages of the case. These filings are common in capital litigation and often take years to resolve. In 2013, the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit issued a ruling rejecting a key federal appeal filed on behalf of Jarvis Masters. The court concluded that the arguments presented did not meet the legal threshold required to overturn the conviction under federal law. The decision represented another step in a legal process that had already stretched across nearly 3 decades. Inside East Block, the physical surroundings remained unchanged. Concrete walls, metal bars, the narrow view through the back window of the cell. Outside the prison, attorneys continued filing legal briefs and petitions. Inside the prison, daily routines continued in quiet repetition. For prisoners living on death row at San Quentin State Prison, court decisions arrive slowly. And when they do, the ruling often appears on a few printed pages delivered through institutional mail. The words can take years to reach the cell. But once they arrive, they carry the weight of decades of waiting. Writing from a cell. Inside death row housing at San Quentin State Prison, the physical boundaries of daily life are sharply defined. The cell is the center of nearly everything. Meals arrive through the door slot. Mail is delivered by correctional staff walking the tier. Legal documents pass between attorneys and prisoners through carefully controlled procedures. And for many incarcerated men, the hours between these scheduled events stretch across long periods of quiet. For Jarvis Masters, writing eventually became a central part of those hours. Prisoners on death row often spend more than 2 decades navigating the legal appeals process. During that time, the pace of court decisions can be slow and uncertain. For some, writing letters becomes a way to maintain connections with the outside world. For others, writing becomes a form of documentation, an attempt to record daily life within the prison system. Masters began writing during the years following his conviction. In interviews and published material, he described how the practice developed gradually inside the cell where he lived. Paper and writing materials are available to prisoners through institutional channels. Books circulate through prison libraries or through donations from outside supporters. Within these limited resources, a number of incarcerated writers have produced memoirs, essays, and reflections about life inside correctional institutions. Masters' writing would eventually form the foundation of a memoir titled That Bird Has My Wings. The book recounts the early years of his life before incarceration. According to the memoir and accompanying interviews, Masters experienced an unstable childhood marked by poverty, violence, and frequent encounters with the criminal justice system at a young age. Those early experiences were later presented by supporters as context for understanding the trajectory that led him into the prison system. The memoir also documents the years he spent living inside the death row unit at San Quentin State Prison. Masters described the routines of confinement, long periods of isolation, limited movement outside the cell, the slow progression of legal appeals. Within those constraints, he wrote about developing personal disciplines intended to structure his time. Among those practices was meditation. Masters has publicly described learning forms of Buddhist meditation while incarcerated. Over time, he corresponded with Buddhist teachers and spiritual mentors outside the prison system. Some of those individuals later became supporters who advocated on his behalf. The introduction of meditation into prison environments has been studied by researchers in correctional psychology. Programs involving mindfulness and meditation have occasionally been introduced in correctional facilities as voluntary activities intended to help incarcerated individuals manage stress and emotional regulation. Masters' personal practice developed largely through reading and correspondence rather than formal institutional programs. According to published accounts, he spent hours each day reading Buddhist texts and writing reflections about his experiences inside prison. The process of writing a full memoir from within death row conditions required persistence. Prisoners do not have access to computers or digital communication systems used by authors outside prison walls. Manuscripts are typically written by hand. Pages are mailed to editors or supporters who assist in preparing them for publication. That process can take years. In Masters' case, the manuscript eventually reached a wider audience after being published as a book. Its release brought renewed attention to the circumstances of his conviction and the length of time he had spent on death row. Among the most visible supporters of the memoir was media figure Oprah Winfrey. Winfrey publicly recommended the book to readers and praised the depth of reflection contained within its pages. Her endorsement expanded the audience dramatically. Readers who had never previously examined the details of a death penalty case were suddenly introduced to Masters' story. Public reaction was mixed. Some readers focused on the themes of personal transformation and introspection described in the memoir. Others emphasized the underlying conviction for the killing of a correctional officer and questioned the attention being given to the author. Within the legal system, however, the publication of the memoir had no direct effect on the status of the case. Courts evaluate appeals based on evidence, procedural standards, and constitutional law. Public interest, even when widespread, does not alter those legal criteria. Still, outside attention can influence the broader conversation surrounding a case. Advocacy groups, legal organizations, and individual supporters sometimes become involved after learning about a prisoner's circumstances through books, journalism, or documentaries. In Masters' case, supporters organized campaigns urging courts to reconsider aspects of the conviction. They pointed to recanted testimony from certain witnesses and argued that the case deserved renewed scrutiny. Prosecutors and law enforcement officials maintained that the original conviction was supported by the evidence presented at trial. These conflicting views became part of the public discussion surrounding the case. Inside the prison, the environment remained largely unchanged. Death row housing continued to operate under the same strict security structure. Cells remained locked for most hours of the day. Movement remained tightly supervised. Writing continued to take place within the same narrow space. A desk attached to a concrete wall. A small stack of papers. An envelope addressed to someone far beyond the prison walls. For prisoners like Jarvis Masters, the act of writing can serve multiple purposes at once. It records memory. It communicates with the outside world. And sometimes, it becomes part of the legal and public record surrounding a case. But even as manuscripts travel outward through the prison mail system, the writer remains in the same place. Inside the same cell. Within the same tier of steel bars and concrete. Where the routines of confinement continue one day at a time. The long legal road. For prisoners sentenced to death in California, the legal process does not end with the trial. The verdict delivered in a courtroom begins a second process that can last decades. After conviction and sentencing, capital cases move automatically into a series of appellate reviews. The first stage usually takes place within the state court system. In California, death penalty convictions are reviewed directly by the Supreme Court of California. The court examines the trial record to determine whether legal errors occurred that could have affected the outcome. Transcripts from the original proceedings are studied line by line. Attorneys present written arguments addressing evidentiary rulings, jury instructions, and procedural decisions made during the trial. If the conviction and sentence are upheld, the case may then proceed to federal review through a legal process known as habeas corpus. Habeas corpus petitions allow prisoners to argue that their constitutional rights were violated during earlier proceedings. These petitions are typically filed in federal district court and may later move to appellate courts if the claims are rejected. The legal standards governing these reviews are strict. Federal courts do not retry criminal cases. Instead, they evaluate whether the state court's decisions were contrary to clearly established federal law or based on unreasonable interpretations of the evidence. For Jarvis Masters, this process unfolded across many years. Attorneys representing him filed numerous legal challenges examining the circumstances surrounding his conviction for the killing of correctional officer Hal Birchfield inside San Quentin State Prison. Among the issues raised were questions about witness testimony used during the trial. As the years passed, some individuals who had testified against Masters later submitted statements altering or withdrawing portions of their earlier accounts. Such recantations are not uncommon in criminal cases that stretch across long periods of time. But courts treat them with caution. Judges must determine whether new statements are credible and whether they would likely have changed the verdict if presented during the original trial. In many instances, courts conclude that recantations alone do not meet the legal threshold required to overturn a conviction. Masters' legal team also raised arguments concerning the adequacy of representation during earlier phases of the case. Claims of ineffective assistance of counsel are a frequent component of post-conviction litigation in capital cases. Under constitutional law, defendants are entitled to legal representation that meets certain professional standards. However, proving that those standards were violated, and that the violation affected the outcome of the trial, requires substantial evidence. In 2013, a major stage of this legal process reached a conclusion. The United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit reviewed one of Masters' federal habeas petitions. After examining the arguments presented by his attorneys, the court ruled that the claims did not satisfy the requirements necessary to overturn the conviction under federal law. The appeal was denied. For observers outside the legal system, such rulings can appear abrupt. But in reality, they represent the end of long periods of legal review. Briefs may be filed over several years. Judges study thousands of pages of records. Panels of appellate judges deliberate over constitutional standards established through decades of prior rulings. When the decision finally arrives, it is often summarized in a written opinion explaining the court's reasoning. For prisoners awaiting those decisions, the experience is different. Legal rulings arrive by mail. A few pages delivered through the prison's internal distribution system. Sometimes the envelope contains a denial. Sometimes it contains instructions for further proceedings. But once the paper is read, the physical environment of incarceration remains unchanged. For Jarvis Masters, the denial of the federal appeal represented another step in a legal process that had already lasted more than a quarter century. By that time, his memoir had circulated widely among readers outside the prison. Supporters continued to advocate for renewed examination of the case. Prosecutors maintained that the conviction had been properly secured. The legal system moved forward according to its established procedures. Inside the East Block housing unit at San Quentin State Prison, the rhythms of confinement continued. Correctional officers conducted daily counts. Mail was delivered. Prisoners exercised within controlled yard spaces when scheduled. And the long process of legal review continued in the background. Death row incarceration often becomes a life measured in legal documents. Petitions, motions, court orders, each one representing another attempt to revisit the past through the language of law. Some cases end with overturned convictions. Others conclude when courts determine that the original trial met constitutional standards. But for many prisoners, the process simply continues for years without a final resolution. California's death penalty system itself has undergone major changes during that time. Executions in the state have been halted for extended periods due to legal challenges involving lethal injection procedures and administrative policy. As a result, many individuals sentenced to death have remained on death row for decades without an execution date. For prisoners like Jarvis Masters, the legal process continues to move slowly through the courts. Attorneys still review evidence. Advocates still raise questions about the case. And beyond the prison walls, the debate surrounding capital punishment continues across the United States. Inside the cell, however, the passage of time remains constant. Another day, another stack of legal papers, another ruling arriving through the prison mail system, and the same narrow space where the waiting continues. The story of Jarvis Masters remains unresolved in the broader debate surrounding justice, incarceration, and the death penalty. For some observers, his writings represent a record of personal transformation under extreme conditions of confinement. For others, the case remains defined by the killing of correctional officer Hal Birchfield inside San Quentin State Prison. The legal system continues to examine the case through established procedures. And inside the prison, the routines of death row continue as they have for decades. If you would like to follow more real cases examining life inside prisons and the realities of long-term incarceration, you can continue the discussion below. Share your perspective, and consider supporting the documentary by liking, commenting, and subscribing for further investigations into the realities of the prison system.